You say that it's clumsy, but isn't it, as Senator Durbin pointed out, isn't it exactly what President Reagan did when he said he would appoint a woman to the Supreme Court? Isn't it exactly what President Trump did when he said he would appoint a woman to replace Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg?
Actually, it isn't exactly the same. I've looked at what was done in both cases, and what President Biden did was, as a candidate, make this pledge. And that helped politicize the entire nomination process. What President Reagan said is, as one of his Supreme Court justices, he would like to appoint a woman, and he appointed a highly qualified one in Sandra Day O'Connor.
As you're working on this reform, former President Trump is out on the campaign trail. He was out in Texas last night suggesting he may pardon those, if he were elected in 2024, those who were part of the January 6 riots. Given that, can you imagine any circumstances where you could support his election in 2024?
Well, we're a long ways from 2024, but let me say this. I do not think the President Trump should have made that pledge to do pardons. We should let the judicial process proceed.
You say we're
January
a long way away
6th
from...
was a dark day in our history.
And it was, and you voted to convict President Trump as well. Why can't you rule out supporting him in 2024?
Well, certainly it's not likely, given the many other qualified candidates that we have that have expressed interest in running. So it's very unlikely.
Oh, so when Trump and Reagan pledged to nominate a woman to the Supreme Court, that was totally fine and not in the least bit political. But when Biden pledged to nominate a black woman because his pledge stemmed from a campaign promise, well, that changes everything. That makes it completely political. Now I understand. I think. I'll give Senate Republicans this: they are really good at cooking up completely arbitrary rules and then pointing to those made-up rules as evidence to support their conclusions. Mitch McConnell doesn't want to confirm Obama's Supreme Court nominee? Well, that makes sense, because clearly you can't nominate a candidate a year before an election to a Senate with a majority of an opposing party, obviously. And while we're on the topic of very, very real rules, everyone knows you can't nominate someone on the third Wednesday of the month. Had he nominated him on the first Wednesday, fine, but 3 Wednesdays in? I'm sorry, but McConnell simply couldn't allow such a sacrilege to stand. Seem ridiculous? That's because it is. That's because those aren't real rules. Just like pledging to use certain criteria to nominate a Supreme Court justice during one's presidency versus their campaign is in no way disqualifying, and in fact are pretty much exactly the same. It's not Biden who seems foolish here, it's people like Susan Collins who sound more like a 7-year-old making up rules as she goes because she doesn't yet understand social cues. Now, as far as Collins' claim that Biden politicized the process, she voted to confirm the guy who literally called himself the victim of, quote, revenge on behalf of the Clintons. But hey, we wouldn't want to politicize the process or anything. Like, she saw Brett Kavanaugh throwing a temper tantrum at his confirmation hearing, lashing out at Democrats, and Collins decided, yeah, no, that's totally permissible and not in the least bit inappropriate. But Biden signals that he intends to nominate a highly qualified black female judge from a pool of jurists who are already serving on the federal judiciary, and Collins thinks to herself, yeah, no, this is just a bridge too far. The politicization is getting out of hand here. Did I get that right? But here's the most ridiculous part of all of this. When asked if she'd support Trump if he ran again in 2024, she refuses to rule it out. To be clear, she voted to convict him when he was impeached for inciting an insurrection on the US Capitol. She acknowledged his crimes, and yet still can't rule out supporting him definitively. That's like admitting Roy Moore is a pedophile, but still asking him to babysit your teenage daughter. At least the Republicans pretending that Trump did nothing wrong, while completely devoid of an ounce of integrity, at least they have plausible deniability. At least they're consistent in their lies. But conceding that he was responsible and that he should be convicted, which would have disqualified him from all future federal offices, and yet still leaving the door open to put him right back in that job? I mean, dear God, don't these people even want to pretend to have any principles that last longer than an episode of Ted Lasso? And of course she hedges by claiming that it's all very unlikely because of all the other qualified candidates that would be running. But give me a break, as if Trump hasn't effectively already cleared the field. I get that Susan Collins wants to help herself by trafficking in this alternate universe where there's going to be a dozen qualified Republicans vying for the nomination, but I think we all know what 2024 is going to look like, considering the extent to which the GOP exists solely to support the every whim of Donald Trump. So she can give herself all the runway she wants, but she's kidding herself if she thinks that this is all just politics as usual and it's still anyone's ballgame. So to all those people out there under the impression that Susan Collins is a moderate, just remember that she's just as extreme as every other member of her party. Maybe her rhetoric is less inflammatory, sure, but she's just as willing to wrap herself into pretzels to justify every abhorrent position as the next guy. If you're willing to go on national TV and pretend that Biden vowing to give black women a voice on the Supreme Court for the first time in over 200 years is bad, and refusing to definitively rule out voting for the guy who you yourself previously voted to convict, then I've got some bad news for you. You are just as extreme as the farthest fringes of your party. To see more videos like this, click the subscribe button right here on this screen. And if you want to support my work, subscribe to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. I cover the most important stories each week, and my guest is always one of the top political figures, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Jen Psaki, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Nancy Pelosi, Katie Porter, Cory Booker, and so many more. The podcast link is also right here on this screen, so give it a listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.